Hi, my name is David Kelsey, and today we'll be discussing strong and cogent arguments. Strong arguments are defined as those in which it is the case that if the premises are true, the conclusion is then likely to be true. What we say is that the connection in a strong argument, the connection between the premises and conclusion is a connection of probability or likelihood. So while valid arguments have a necessary connection between the premises and conclusion, strong arguments have a connection that is built on probability or likelihood. What this means is that the conclusion of a strong argument is made to be more likely or probable given its premises. This is to say that the premises of a strong argument make the conclusion of the argument more likely to be true than false. Okay, so here's an example. This is the rain today example. So our first premise is that it's rained all week. Therefore, our conclusion is that it will rain today. Note that because it's rained all week, it does seem to be more likely that it will rain today. That often happens, right? You have rain all week and then you continue to get it through the weekend. But also note that even though it's rained all week, this in no way guarantees that it will rain today. For oftentimes what does happen is that it stops raining, right? So thus, even if the premises, or in this case, the premise of this argument is true, the conclusion could still be false, right? The next example we'll discuss is the Swan example. And so with the Swan example, we see the first premise being every swan I've ever seen is white, and so we conclude that all swans are white. We see here that although it's true that I've only ever seen white swans in my life, it happens to be false that all swans are white. In some parts of the world, actually, there are blue and even black swans. I think in Australia, for example. And so in a strong argument, it is possible to have true premises and a false conclusion. Now, this is exactly the reason why a strong argument is not valid. Because in a valid argument, if we have true premises, the conclusion must be true. But in a strong argument, it's quite possible to have true premises and a false conclusion. So strong arguments cannot be valid. Okay? The next point is that for strong arguments, we can actually have some that are stronger than others, right? And the idea is based upon the amount of evidence that you have. So the more evidence you have in your premises, the more likely your conclusion is to be, and the stronger your argument is, right? So let's look back at the Swan example to see this point quite clearly. So the first premise again is that every swan I've ever seen is white, and so we conclude that all swans are white. Now imagine in this case, right, that you've seen in your life 10 swans, and they've all been white, and so you conclude that all swans are white. Okay? Really, this is, not quite that strong of an argument, really. 10 swans is really not enough support to draw the conclusion that all swans are white, right? But imagine, though, that you in your life were a kind of bird watcher of sorts, and you had seen actually something like 50,000 swans in your life, and they'd all been white, right? And then you concluded from that all the swans there are white. In this case, this would actually be a really well-supported and a really strong argument, and a conclusion that happens to be really, really likely, right? And so the more evidence you have, the more likely your conclusion becomes. It's just that simple, right? The next point we'll make, we will look at an argument that happens to be strong, but also that is based upon a false premise and a false conclusion. Again, with strong arguments, it's not so much whether the premises and conclusion are true or false, but it's how they connect to each other that makes them strong. Okay, so this would be what we call the reverse gravity example. So imagine that gravity on this planet on Earth was actually reversed. And so when you actually drop something from your hand, it somehow floated up into the sky and not down. Okay? Now imagine that you have a pen in your hand, okay? And so the premise goes, every time I've ever dropped something from my hand, I've ever let go of something from my hand, it floats up to the sky. And so therefore I conclude that if I let go of this pen from my hand at this moment, it will float up to the sky. Okay, so now notice that in this case, even though it's all false, right, it's actually ridiculous and kind of ludicrous. Notice that if that was true, that every time I'd ever in my life let go of anything from my hand, it floated up and not down, that it would seem to be quite likely, in fact, that the same thing would happen if I right now let go of this pen, right? And so we have here again a conclusion that seems to be more likely based upon its premises, right? And so we have here again another strong argument, but in this case with a false premise and a false conclusion. Now, next concept we will discuss is the idea of a cogent argument. And a cogent argument, the concept here mirrors a bit the idea of soundness to validity, right? So the analogous point is that we draw the same kind of point between cogency and strength. So as a cogent argument is to a strong argument, a sound argument is to a valid one. So the idea is with cogency, you have a strong argument that has true premises. And so, of course, the conclusion of a cogent argument is one that is likely to be true. Okay? So a great example of a cogent argument, one of my favorites, is the sun rises and sets example. So the sun rises and sets example goes like this. 1, every day of my life, the sun has risen in the morning and set in the evening. And so therefore 2, tomorrow the sun will rise in the morning and set in the evening. Here again, notice that this, as far as strong arguments go, this is about as strong an argument as we can make. Because really your evidence for this, my evidence for this premise that I'm making here, is really every day of my life. And that's quite a lot of evidence, me being 40 years old. So, this is a great example of a strong argument. Again, it happens to be, a situation in which we can see that the conclusion is about as likely as something could be, right? That the sun is going to rise and set tomorrow. That's about as likely as something could be without being guaranteed, right? Because of course, tomorrow, right, it being tomorrow, we don't really know for sure, for certain, that the sun will rise and set tomorrow. But nevertheless, it seems about as close to certainty as possible because of all the evidence we really have for it, namely, every day of our lives, right? The last point, or the next to last point we'll be making here is about the idea of prediction. So we see that with cogent arguments and strong arguments comes the idea of prediction, right? And so in each of our examples so far, we've had a bit of a kind of prediction being made. And that's always in the idea of a strong or cogent argument, is that there is a kind of prediction being made in the conclusion, right? So for example, in the sun rises tomorrow and sets, we have a prediction about what's going to happen tomorrow, namely that the sun is going to rise and set, right? In the reverse gravity example, of course, we have a prediction about what's going to happen if I let go of this pen from my hand. And then lastly, in the rain today example, we have a prediction about whether or not it's going to rain today, right? And then, of course, in the final example, the swans example, we have a bit of a prediction about the color of every swan there is, right? Namely that they're all white. So usually with, in fact, I think always with strong and cogent arguments, you have a kind of prediction element between the premise and conclusion of the argument. Okay? And so, again, of course, because there is this predictive element, this forward-looking element with strong and cogent arguments, then, of course, we see that because we can't always get it right, the predictions are predictions about the future, for example, that we do in strong and cogent arguments always have the possibility that the conclusion will turn out false, because as we can see, it's always the possibility that our prediction turns out wrong. Okay, that'll do it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.